Writers in my comments section asked me how I convinced myself to sit down and actually do some writing, even when I don't feel like it, as well as a bunch of other writing related questions. Some of them were easier to answer than others. Writing's hard, but it doesn't have to be done alone. That's why I wanted you to get it off your chest and tell me what you wanted to know most about writing, and you really delivered. So I've gone through the first 10 questions, taken the time to think them through a little bit, and then given you answers that hopefully go a bit beyond the usual tried and true advice. First up, let's tackle motivation. This is a question from Hannis. How do you force yourself to write even if you can't find the motivation or energy to write? That's a great question. It's also a really hard one to answer because every writer has a slightly different relationship with writing. In all honesty, I can go months without writing, but during that time, I'll still be thinking about a story, making notes about one, or editing something, which I personally still count as writing, even though I'm not actually putting words down. However, when I'm in the middle of a book, I don't write every day. I never write every day, but I am a bit more regular about getting words down. That regularity and that motivation for me comes from thinking ahead to the finished project. It's really hard when you're 10,000 words into a novel that's going to be 100,000 words, and you've got to somehow sit down and convince yourself to add 1% to that total, because it feels like you're never going to get there. Progress is really slow and hard fought, and even though you're working towards that goal of a finished novel, which is, a great goal for any writer, sometimes that still doesn't feel like quite enough of a push. My advice to you would be to think about what motivates you, even outside of writing. What do you love? What do you enjoy? What do you look forward to in life? And is there any way that you can tie that into a finished project? I'm driven by learning things and making improvements on what I did last time and achieving things, whatever the hell that means. That's what pushes me. And it's okay if you don't really know what motivates you. In that case, you've got to find out a bit more about yourself. And one of the best ways to do that takes about 5 minutes and is totally free, is to do a Myers-Briggs test. 16personalities.com have a free one. It's a bit outdated now, and it shouldn't be relied upon. It's like an IQ test or anything like that. It doesn't really mean anything, but it will give you some insights into what will motivate people with your personality type. So that might be a place where you can just read through and figure out something that might motivate you or might give you a push to keep going. In terms of energy, I don't think there's a great answer I can give you on that. I work a full-time job myself on top of my own writing and making YouTube videos and doing developmental editing and all that other stuff. And I often find I'm tired and I don't have time to do stuff. So for me, it becomes a matter of priority. And the one time in every day where I know I've got time to do something is before anything else has happened. I put writing first and foremost in my day. As soon as I wake up at 6 a.m, I will do an hour's worth of writing and just get it done, because then no matter what happens for the rest of the day, and no matter what goes wrong, I've still got that writing done and I've made that 1% of progress. That also contributes to motivation for me, because I'm like, at least I got that done. At least this day has something that was worthwhile about it. Sounds a bit dark, that. I don't hate my life, I promise you. But anyway, I hope that helps in some way, and stick with it. I know the feeling though. Next question is from Ed. Are you a pouncer or a planner? Pouncer might be another word for pantser, or it might be a typo, but either way, we know what you mean. The answer is, I'm somewhat of an awkward hybrid. I will often plan the biggest parts of the book, which to me are the opening and the ending. I'll probably know about those in advance, and then the middle section, I tend to make up a bit more as I go. I do plan in the very short term though. The way I work is if I'm writing a scene or a chapter or something and I get an idea for what I want to come next, I'll just press return a few times and then make notes to it so that when I get there, I know where I'm going and I just kind of swing from point to point that way. That works for me because I find fully planning a story impossible. I can't think in that level of detail so far ahead. And the one time I've actually tried to do that, I found it sort of took the fun out of writing for me a bit. But having said that, I can't go off no plan whatsoever, because then I lose all direction and all semblance of a cohesive plot. One thing I'll say is the whole planner and pantser thing is kind of a myth. You generally aren't one or the other. It's more of a spectrum. Some parts you'll really like to plan, some parts you'll prefer to wing. Not everybody's going to be 100% one way or the other. You might be, but you might not be. The key to it, as with all things in writing really, is to experiment and find out what works for you, and most importantly, what's fun, because if it's not fun, where's your incentive to keep going? So, hope that helps. Next question is from Mohak. I was wondering if you could share some tips on how to write urban fantasy novels and supernatural thrillers. I've always been a fan of the genre, but I've noticed that it's quite rare to find a good one these days in India. I'd love to learn from your expertise and create my own masterpiece in this genre. Love from India, and happy Diwali to you. Thanks for your question, Mohak. I'm a bit late, but hope you had a great Diwali. I'm going to be completely honest with you and say that I don't have any specific directions to give you on those genres simply because I haven't written them myself. My opinion and my advice on writing always comes from stuff that I've tried myself, stuff I have direct experience in. So that's where I think I can add value. And if I don't have that experience, I wouldn't want to lead you wrong. I'm sure you've already thought of this, but my general advice would be to have a look at some common conventions of the genre. But I don't say that so that you can figure out exactly what you need to have in your story. I say that so you can maybe figure out what you like and what you might want to be part of your story. Then I'd carry those forward whilst also preserving what comes naturally to you about writing. Conventions and to some extent, I guess, tropes can be really useful for setting reader expectations, but it's your individual writing style and your idiosyncrasies that will make readers fall in love with your writing and make them want to come back and read more of your stuff rather than just the tropes themselves, I think. So I'd always prioritise what you want to write over what you think you should, if that makes sense. Next up, KiwiJ23 asks, do you have any advice on writing from multiple points of view? Thanks for your question. First of all, I love writing in multiple perspectives. It's my favourite way to keep my own interest in the book that I'm writing and also in ones I'm reading. I've written books with multiple POVs in a few times now. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. But the biggest thing that I think I've learned is that step one is understanding your characters properly. And the reason I say that is if you're going to switch between characters, you need to make that as easy and as clear for readers as possible, and you need to make sure that your characters feel different. The first way I'd do that is to make sure that they have different voices, and not just in dialogue. That is important, but don't forget that you can add a voice to third-person narration just as easily as you can dialogue. It's really easy to forget to add those little flourishes of language and of attitude in your narration, but if you can make your character's voice come through loud and clear, it'll help your readers stay clear on who they're listening to, and it'll also increase characterization quite a bit as well. The other piece of advice I'd give you is to take advantage of writing in multiple perspectives. The conventional thing to do is to tell the story from different characters in different locations with different storylines, and that adds a lot of detail and a lot of colour to your writing. That's what I'm doing in my current book. But you don't have to be so disconnected with it. You can tell the same scene or the exact same events from multiple perspectives if it reveals something new that wasn't there before. For example, imagine building two separate storylines from two totally disconnected characters for an entire novel before they finally meet in the very last chapter and we see it from both of them. I'd read that, personally. But anyway, hope that helps in some way. Really interesting question from Hugo next. Do you see a magnum opus in your future, something you'd hope to be remembered for? I hadn't really thought about it too much directly, to be honest, but I think it's always been in the back of my mind. It's probably in the back of every writer's mind. Do I see one in my future? I really don't know. I don't know if I could write something that's good enough to be remembered by. But I would like to. I approach every book and every story I write, really, intending to make it the best I've ever written. And I usually tend to feel that it is better than the last. Sometimes by quite a bit, sometimes just by a tiny bit, but that's usually my goal. But there is a point, I suppose, where you peak as a writer. And, you know, for all I know, I could have already peaked. So magnum opus in the future, I really don't know. Honestly, it might sound really corny, but instead of a magnum opus or something that sells 1 million copies, because I know that's never going to happen, I would really like to write something that someone really loves. But not just that, the kind of book that they read again and again through like good times and bad times. I want to write the kind of book that is a friend to someone, if that makes sense. That's what I really hope I can do. Also, an HBO miniseries based on anything I've written would be great, so if anyone knows anyone. Next up is a bit more of a technical one. So Ruddy says, what's holding me back is action scenes and tension, specifically how to build it through dialogue, through description and so on. I love tension when I'm reading. I love how you often don't notice it building until you're in the midst of it, and by then it's too late. I find the experience is similar when you're actually writing it. It tends to ramp up without you really noticing until it's at a really tense point and you're suddenly aware of the tension yourself. I think it's that slow build or that ramp upwards that is the key point, really. Tension isn't something like a switch that can be turned on or off. It builds like a bonfire does. To me, that means that time is a big part of it. There has to be some kind of time constraint, especially if something doesn't happen before something else, then X consequence occurs. And that consequence itself is also part of the tension. It's often referred to as the stakes of the story. What's on the line if everything goes to pot? And the last thing I think that helps increase tension is a lack of information. If you tell the reader absolutely everything that they need to know, there's no wondering and there's nothing to be tense about because they're secure in knowing exactly that they're keeping up and everything's level. And to some extent, you can then predict what's going to happen because you have all the facts in front of you. But lack of information really helps to build tension because it makes the reader think, and it also stops them from being able to see directly ahead. That combination of things makes them feel like they're moving forward, irresistibly moving forward with no idea what's in front of them. That's good for tension. I'm not saying they're the only three things you need: some element of time, some consequence, and some lack of information. But I think they're a really good start. My advice then would be to read over your scene 3 times with each of those things in mind and just check if it's there. You don't have to ham it up and completely go all in on one thing and start saying, 29, she moved towards the corridor, 28, she opened the door. It doesn't have to be like that, but even just a brief mention of it, just so that it's in the back of the reader's mind, I think that can do enough. Then, in a more general practical sense, just decrease your paragraph and your sentence length if you can, the closer you get to, X thing that you want them to be tense about. Really dial it in those last few seconds. Make your sentences shorter and shorter as the clock ticks down, getting closer and closer. Disaster is almost there. The answer is just out of reach. Then, whatever happens. That's my advice, anyway. Next up, Lexi asks, so when it comes to inciting incidents, I know generally you'd have one incident that jumpstarts the story, so to speak, but the story I'm writing doesn't exactly have one significant incident. More or less it's a series of incidents that build tension and cause the main character to slowly unravel. I'm writing a memoir but would like it to read like a good novel. Just been really stuck on the inciting incident thing. It's slowed me down immensely. Thanks, Lexi. This is a really interesting one, and I'm probably not going to give you a normal answer on this. Honestly, I have never once worried about an inciting incident in my novels, for better or for worse. I'm not a big structure or formula user, though I'm not saying that they don't work or that it's bad to use them or anything like that. It's just not me. It just doesn't really suit me. I also don't ride motorbikes because that doesn't suit me either. So my opinion would be to step back from your story if you can and ask yourself, first of all, do you definitely need an inciting incident? To an extent, what led you to be worrying about this or thinking about this? Is it that you're reading over the story and you're in the early parts and you're thinking, something should happen here because this is boring, how do I get into the story? Or are you looking at novel plans and structures and thinking, I'm supposed to have an inciting incident here and I haven't got one? If it's the latter, my advice would be to just get started. Just write whatever you feel like you want to write now and start wherever you want to start. Because the beginning, as it is at the moment, might not necessarily stay the beginning. You're always going to edit any completed story at least once, so you're going to have to come back and look at the beginning again when the whole story is complete, because myriad things can change while you're writing in the process of a long piece of work. And you're not carving this into a really expensive piece of marble. You can change the shape after it's already done. You're just drafting. I'd say just get something down now that you know you can build on, because it's not make or break right this minute. You don't have to get it right at the moment. If it's the first way though, and you feel like there is something missing or that something needs to change or something needs to happen, and you're novelizing a memoir, I suppose you are limited by what can happen. There's only so many things that you want to really fictionalize and make up about it, because at some point it'll stop being a memoir. You mentioned though that your character is eventually going to unravel, and it's a series of events that really cause your character to unravel. So I would maybe start with that. I'm thinking about that old trope in 80s movies where the camera stops at some sort of terrible moment and says, "That's me. I bet you're wondering how I ended up here. Let me start from the beginning." I'm not saying be that flippant about it, but if you're worrying about giving readers a reason to stick with you or something to read on for that's interesting, perhaps show them a snapshot of how the story ends, and then you can spend the novel working towards that payoff, and they know that they're reading towards it, or they're reading forward and following through for that payoff. You can add all sorts of context and information that the reader doesn't have at the start, so that when they come to it at the end, it feels different and is surprising and whatever else. But it could just be a way to kickstart things if you're really struggling with it. So just a suggestion anyway, but hopefully that helps. Next up, Old Fat Dad asks, hang on, I'm all for self-deprecating humour, my friend, but I'm going to edit your username. So, Experienced Substantial Dad asks, I have written and rewritten the same story in different ways and now have difficulty understanding what's actually on the page. I've taken some time away from it, but I'm still struggling. Have you got any suggestions? This is a great one, thank you. I do have suggestions. The first one will be really disappointing, but you said you'd taken some time away from it. Take more time, take a year if you have to, and I know that's really frustrating, but it can genuinely be the best way to bring clarity to a piece of work, unless you can figure out how to factory reset your own brain, which I would be really interested to know, because I think that would be really useful. However, I will give you some other non-disappointing suggestions. Firstly, did you keep any drafts of the story as you were going through? Because how I write books is I'll write a first draft and then I will copy and paste it into a whole nother document and use that as my second draft and edit that. So I can keep the first one as it was. The reason I do that is because the first draft of anything can get closer to what you were trying to do, for want of a better phrase, than subsequent later drafts do. So I'd suggest stop reading your current draft and go back and read an old draft, and maybe make a note of what's different, what stands out to you, and what you feel might be missing in the new draft that is present in the first one, or the other way around. My next suggestion can be really hard to do depending on circumstances, but it's get somebody else to read it for you and tell you what they think, but it has to be someone that you trust and someone whose opinion that you value. That alone, though, isn't necessarily enough. I think it's also important to prime that person as well. So giving someone your work and saying, let me know what you think of it, is just so wide open that it can paralyze a lot of people, especially when they're being really careful not to hurt your feelings. You'll tend to find they will find something that they like about it and they'll just tell you that, which is great, but not necessarily all that helpful. So instead, if you prime them by saying, read this through and tell me one thing that you would change and one thing that you think I should keep, that way they'll feel more balanced about it, and you've asked them specifically to give you something that they would change. So you're kind of opening the door for them to give you constructive but negative feedback. And when they give you their answer, the most important thing to do is gently ask them why and ask them to elaborate and get them to go as far as you can, and just keep prompting them, because therein you'll find an answer that is really the sort of root of the problem. They'll tell you how they feel about it, and we're all interested in how readers feel, and we want to manipulate that and make them feel how we want them to feel. So that's going to be the most useful part of it. However, I do acknowledge that of course not everybody has someone that they could trust, and also sharing your work is a massive barrier for a lot of people, and I get that. I would encourage you to take that barrier on as soon as you possibly can, but it's easier said than done. Next question, AA Ryan, a regular in the comment section, thank you very much. He asks, are there any rules you use that you have to tell yourself to use so that you actually end up using them? Like the kinds of things you'd keep written above the screen so that you can be constantly reminded while you're working on any given scene. If so, what are they? That's a great question. So I don't have anything physically pinned to my monitor besides the ever-present to-do list, but I do have something that I always keep in mind when I'm writing. It's kind of a Swiss Army knife of questions, I suppose. It's really simple, but I just keep asking myself the question, why does this matter? And if you're thinking, How do you mean? In relation to what and matters to what? Yes. All of the above. Everything. Why does it matter to the plot? Why does it matter to the reader? Why does it matter to the character? Why does it matter to the world? The reason I do this is because it helps me to keep my writing a bit more personal and helps me to keep writing for a reason. Like, that reason can change. I can be writing a certain bit because it matters to characterization, and the next bit because it matters to the plot, or because it makes a wider point. But for me, it all has to matter for some reason. And if the answer is, doesn't really matter, but I think it's cool, then I know that's probably a candidate for the chopping block. That probably sounds overly simple, and it'll probably sound too simple to me when I edit this back, but the more you think about it, the more it helps, especially if you come across problems while you're writing something and you're not really sure if something should be included or not. Asking yourself if it matters to the character or the audience or anything, it can give you a bit of insight. This is really helpful in editing as well, deciding what to cut, so hopefully that answers the question. The next question's from Liz, who asks, what's the difference between a beat and a scene? Great question. I'm not really sure what the actual definitions would be on this, but I can give you my take on it for whatever that's worth. To me, I think of scenes in a visual way. To me, they're where and when something's taking place. I always imagine a play, for example. You know, maybe there's a bunch of characters sitting around a table before the scene shifts, and then it's a different time or location or set of characters or whatever. They're big moments. Beats, on the other hand, I see as tiny moments, I think. They're little turning points in the story. They can be little realizations or from your character or new bits of information that come to light that change the orientation or the heading of the story. They are things that happen that change the course of the overall story, either in a small way or in a big way. They're kind of like those levers that you used to have on the side of train tracks where the guy would lean out and pull it and then the train would go a different direction. I can't make a video without a stupid analogy, but hopefully that one makes a bit of sense. That's my take on it anyway. But the big difference, I would say, is size and number. Scenes are much bigger and there's fewer of them. Beats are more regular and much smaller. There could be a bunch of beats within a scene, for example. That's my take on it anyway. Clear as mud, as usual. But if you want to know my take on something else, feel free to ask me a question in the comments section down below. And if you've already sent me a question, I'm going to make another video and I will get to them. As always, thank you so much for watching and happy writing.